Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we have investigative journalist and author Gary Weiss to talk about his new book, Retail Gangster, which is about Crazy Eddie Antar. If you have not been born in the Northeast, you may not know about Crazy Eddie, but we'll talk about it. We'll say why it's such an important part of growing up in the Northeast because of the obnoxious commercials. We dive into a lot of stuff in the book here. So by the time you get to the end of it, you may start thinking, wait, do I even need to read the book anymore? Trust me, we only scratched the surface. The book is fantastic. It was great talking to Gary. Yeah, then let's get to it. I'm going to shut up and let you hear it. Gary Weiss talking about his book, Retail Gangster. All right, here we are with Gary Weiss, author of Retail Gangster, about the story of Crazy Eddie Antar. Gary, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Brendan. I very much appreciate it.
Now, before we get to the book, which I absolutely love, this is not your first foray into something big. You've taken down, or should I say mentioned or brought about information about some, let's say, financial issues before. Can you give just a little quick background of some of the things that you've done before this book that kind of got you a little bit of notoriety?
Sure. I've been in financial journalism since the 80s. I was at Barron's magazine. Before Barron's, I was at newspapers, and I worked in Washington, D.C. for a while. But I began in financial journalism in the 80s with Barron's as a financial publication. And I moved on to Business Week. And in Business Week, I started doing investigative stuff. I gravitated to that. I did several articles on organized crime getting involved in the stock market in the late 1990s. And that led to my first book, Born to Steal, which was about a particular crook who was involved in the stock market. And then I did a sort of a broader, more sweeping book called Wall Street versus America, which came out in the late 2000s. And then more recently, in 2012, I did a book about Ayn Rand and her influence. It's a little bit of a departure for me. Her influence on American values and American culture. It was sort of inspired by Ayn Rand's influence on the key decision makers and on Wall Street in the run up to the 2008 crash. But for the most part, I'd say what I've been mainly and certainly this Crazy Eddie book is sort of as a return to is to my roots. Which is my financial fraud roots. I mean, in a way, it's like a return to Born to Steal, which was my mafia book, because it's about, a man who was essentially a racketeer. I mean, he wasn't a gangster perhaps in the orthodox sense. And one of the questions that people have asked me is, was he really a gangster? Was he really a racketeer? And he really came close to being one. I believe that's why we called it Retail Gangster. And I think in some respects, he was one of the worst people I've ever written about.
Yeah, I definitely have questions on that one specifically because as it unfolds, he just looks worse and worse. But before I get there, I do want to ask one question. You have mentioned you've written about organized crime. Is it anything like Goodfellas? Do I have to worry about anybody showing up at my door tomorrow saying, you talked to that Gary Weiss guy, you need to take that down? I just want to be prepared in case I have to.
No, absolutely not. This is not about violent people. This is not about killers. This is about individuals who are involved in a major fraud. Although there are organized crime elements, as you know from reading the book, they had organized crime connections. One of the rising stars at Crazy Eddie went on to become the street boss of the Bonanno crime family, Vinny Badalamenti. That I think is one of the more interesting aspects of the book. That's to me what really fascinated me about Retail Gangster, about Crazy Eddie, getting into this as a book, is that underneath every rock, there was another rock and another rock and another rock, and then all the slime underneath that. It's like these subplots and the twists and the turns were amazing. I didn't expect to find that this former stockroom boy who worked at the village store wound up in organized crime. I mean, there's all this weirdness about the story, all the strangeness, which is really which was what fascinated me. But to answer your question, go back to your question. No, I mean, this is not a group of violent people by any stretch of the imagination. No, although there was domestic violence. for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, once you get to the end of it, you're like, this is not a nice dude. But I also, for the listeners, think that is really important because, as we talked about before we hit record, I'm from the New York area. The tri-state area is very much where Crazy Eddie comes up from. I did an informal poll. And my friends from California had no idea what I was talking about. I said, well, trust me, if you are from the tri-state area, there is a certain time period where you heard your first Crazy Eddie commercial, which was the most obnoxious thing on earth, but you could not get it out of your head. But before we even get to the commercials, the first part of your book, I think, is so important to understanding who this guy was. Can you give a little background of the community that Crazy Eddie grew up in and kind of how that created what he would become later on?
Well, he came from the Antar family, came from Aleppo, Syria, or Aleppo, Syria, I believe is the correct pronunciation. Right after World War I, the Jewish community in Syria has always been, practically going back many millennia, has always been sort of the second-class citizens, persecuted. And things sort of reached a fever pitch after World War I. They just had to get out. Things were just going horrible. Even though the war had ended, the Middle East, the war had ended, but the conflict continued, the violence continued. So the Antar family came out of Aleppo, Syria, in 1920. And it was a very insular, and it is a very insular community. It's very religious. And he was a product of the Syrian Jewish culture. But what he did was, because the Syrian Jewish culture emphasized the government as an adversary. This is something that dates back to Syria, because the government and the Syrian government, the Turkish rulers of Syria, were anti-Semitic, and they persecuted Jewish people, and so the government was kind of the enemy. Sort of an after effect since then has been that you don't share anything with the government if at all possible. You try not to pay more than your share of taxes. I'll put it to you that way. And dealing in cash became a big thing in among Syrians and among the Syrian Jewish community. So cash, or nechti as it is called among Syrians, dealing in cash, storing cash in your ceiling, not putting it in the bank, putting it in a mattress. This became the basis of everything bad. Now, that's not illegal, by the way. You can do that, nothing wrong with it. But what Eddie did was manipulated the nechti, the cash, in order to commit his crimes, which were financial crimes, and involved manipulation of cash, going beyond tax evasion, which is the obvious thing that happens when you're dealing with cash. You don't pay the government. But they were able to manipulate the cash that they took in from the customers in order to falsify their financial records. And this was the basis of the Crazy Eddie scam as a corporate scam.
And he's in that position to do it because, as you were just talking about, part of that community is building up your own family. It seems so simple on paper, and of course there's a lot more to it, but it's, especially for the Antar family, it's, okay, somebody owns a store, then somebody opens this store. Okay, now you're the manager of that store, you do well, you end up owning your own store. That's how Eddie comes into this, which is the business is family, but somebody's always kind of in charge. And that's kind of how Eddie learned the ropes. I love that part of it where you talk about people walk into the store, and before even Crazy Eddie, you went into one of these stores, you were supposed to haggle. Eddie got a lot of education on how to run a business just through his family, because it seemed like everybody in his family had a store somewhere.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is a family story. I mean, you touched on a very important point. The Antars and the Syrian Jewish community, when they came to this country, they got into retail stores. It became a family business. Family was the most important thing. You dealt with other members of the family. You dealt with your extended family. And Eddie, therefore, was sort of spawned from this tradition. His father was sort of the head of the family, and Eddie, he wasn't actually the firstborn son. That's one of the little twists in the plot. He was ostensibly the firstborn son, so therefore his father, sort of showered upon him all the, set him up in business, and he actually was not the firstborn son. His father had a family out in California first, which was a big family secret. But then, as you correctly point out, he was set up in this store, and in training to operate his store, he went to work in Times Square in these sleazy joints, these gift shops that cater to tourists. And this is where he learned all the tricks of the trade to rip off customers. You overcharge them, tremendously overcharge them, and you sell. How to sell.
And that was a great part of it. I love it where it's, we're going to make more money off of Y, but people want to buy X. So you bring them into the store to buy X. Then you say, hey, you know what? You can buy Y though. Y is so much better. And it's this, grift of just upselling and pushing them towards what you want them to buy, even though they're coming in. Which I should say, if you go to Times Square right now, you're going to get overcharged for everything anyway, even a burger at Fridays. But this was an entirely different type of thing where the entire business structure was set up to just get every nickel out of somebody who walked in the door before they left.
Oh, yeah. He became very good at selling $50 binoculars for $300, that kind of thing. It was just out and out ripoff. And it's also where, he refined the technique. And this was very important at Crazy Eddie, bait and switch. The customer comes in for product Y, comes in perhaps for an advertised special, but the advertised special doesn't give Eddie quite the same profit margin as his own house brand, which he has manufactured out there in Vermont. So the whole trick, the whole methodology of Crazy Eddie was to get the customer to buy what benefited you, not what he really wanted, and to advertise one thing and sell him the other. They did that for 20 years. It's really not legal, but they kind of got away with it for such a long time. Because, in New York City, so much bad was going on in New York at the time that you could run an operation that stole pretty much from everybody. The aspects of it that were public, such as the bait and switch, was known to be bait and switch, was patently illegal. You could get away with it because the authorities had better things to do.
And it seems to be, because we're still pretty early on. Like, he's not officially quote unquote Crazy Eddie yet. Like, this is the beginning of him. It seems to me that he takes off and he really starts going down a dark path. And you explain this is they just figured out, hey, we don't actually have to give the government its cut the way we're doing things. I think it was sales tax specifically where you said they just didn't pay it because they realized nobody from the government was kind of watching it. And that's when it seemed like the profits started to grow enough that he could start thinking about becoming this mogul, what would become Crazy Eddie. The impetus for it is that place in Times Square where all of a sudden he really learned some things that he maybe wasn't told by the family that he started to branch out.
Yeah, you're certainly right about that. He was able to undercut his competitors by charging the customer's sale tax and keeping it. I mean, it's really kind of a brilliant strategy when you think about it. I mean, the math is pretty simple. So he undercut his competitors by cheating the government. It was just a really very simple way of making money. And he was able to do that because of cash, because at the time he did not take credit cards and everything was in cash. So if you're dealing only in cash, it comes back to cash. If you're dealing only in cash, you can get away with that kind of thing.
Now, you have the way he goes about doing things. He's making the money and everything. But the reason why we call him Crazy Eddie is he's got some people come in. He starts to figure out advertising. And again, if you are from the Northeast and you were born in the 80s or around, you know exactly what a Crazy Eddie commercial is. Our prices are insane. It's a guy screaming at the commercial, which, by the way, I need to admit right now, up until about 5 years ago, I thought the guy in the Crazy Eddie commercial actually was Crazy Eddie. He was just an ad man, an actor. But this is what takes him and makes him a household name is the advertisements. Can you talk a little bit about that, how the Crazy Eddie commercials became what they became?
Well, the Crazy Eddie commercials are absolutely brilliant. The thing that's interesting about Crazy Eddie as a company is that, you had like the front of the store, so to speak, and you had the people who were marketing Crazy Eddie were completely legitimate. They were just doing a great job. They formulated these commercials and they worked with this guy, Jerry Carroll, who was the public face of Crazy Eddie. And they came up with these brilliant commercials while at the same time sort of in the back office, they were robbing everybody in sight, and one end, well, certainly the people in marketing didn't know what was going on in the back end. That I think is really kind of interesting. It's a little bit like what happened with Bernie Madoff. He had like two ends of his operation. One end didn't know what the other end was doing. But they came up with some brilliant commercials. And as Larry Weiss, who was the sort of the marketing maven of Crazy Eddie, as he explained it to me, when these people weren't trained, they were, they were just seat of the pants young guys. What they found is that the public liked something to hate, so they made these commercials deliberately abrasive, and that really worked. Everybody hated the Jerry character. He would shout and scream, and people just couldn't stand. I remember my father hated it. He would just say, "What is that? No, you can't go to that store. It's ridiculous." But people flocked to the store. People love to have something to hate.
I mean, it definitely sounds like basically how news is run today, but I'm not going to get into that. We're going to skip over that. But these commercials come out and they start exploding. I mean, we're hitting the high points of the book, but I think the best parts for me were always kind of the guts of it, how they were making money around the margins and everything like that. What my favorite anecdote along those lines is, if one of their stores had a flood or something, they would grab merchandise from other stores that wasn't selling and just throw them into the store that's flooded before they called the cops or the fire department or anything like that, and just said, "Oh, then we'll just write it off, right? It's wet, it's in the store, and we'll just write it off that it was there." Honestly, and you hate to say it because there is some really bad stuff going on here, but they were ingenious in a lot of the things that they figured out.
Oh, yeah. On the one hand, you had this sort of very sort of fine-tuned financial fraud, very sophisticated, dealing with the skim, the cash skim, the NECD that I mentioned earlier. And then you had like street level stuff. And you had the stuff that you're talking about, spiking the claim, outright insurance fraud. And, it leads to something that's really, I think, one of the more interesting elements of this story. They got away with it. They did so much. They stole from everybody. I mean, literally everybody. Everybody, if you got close to Eddie, he'd rip you up. They stole from the guy who brought them public, this hardworking fella who got Eddie in touch with the investment bank, Oppenheimer, got him in touch with him, didn't pay him a nickel, ripped him off. Eddie stole from everybody, and he got away with, I'd say, 90% of what he did. He got away with it. There was just so much. When you commit so many crimes, there's such a volume of crime, you're gonna get a pass on some of it. The prosecutor's going to only prosecute you on so much.
Well, and also, he was really getting away with everything up until, and it seemed this is where it all starts going wrong for him, Crazy Eddie's doing so well, and they decide they're going to go the IPO route. That seems to be the line of demarcation where if you're full of it, this is where people are really going to start to dig into you. They're going to want to know why the numbers are the numbers that they are. And I do want to compliment you. I hate economics. I usually get completely confused. You walk the reader through, so it's nice and easy to understand. It's like, hey, they kept showing 5% growth or 15 or 20, and everybody said, how are they doing it? Which means they had to keep showing it. I never even knew that Crazy Eddie was trying to be an IPO. Of course, I was 10 at the time. I probably wasn't paying attention at all. But that's where it seems to go wrong, is that Eddie really starts to bite off more than he can chew. And that's when everyone seems to start going after each other.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely correct. They came up, one of the Eddie's financial advisor, Sam Antar, his cousin, who cooperated with me on the book. He figured out a wonderful way to sort of fabricate profits and to have an absolutely fantastic IPO. Problem with going public, problem with selling your stock to the public is that the public becomes a partner, and there's a lot of papers that have to be filed. You got to make disclosures to the public, so you're under scrutiny that you wouldn't have been if you hadn't gone public. And that was, to a certain extent, his big mistake. They went too far. They got too greedy, and they didn't really think things through a little bit, like when you're playing chess. Well, wait a second. When I become public, am I going to be able to fool the entire investment public? They were just so full of it, that they couldn't fool everybody who bought their stock, and they couldn't fool the FBI.
What I found very interesting is, as with many things that happen, something like Bear Stearns or everything, there's always somebody who's sitting there saying something's off. And sometimes that person is you, by the way, throughout these years. But for Crazy Eddie, one of the things that a lot of skeptics said right away was, this is a family business and it's still a family business. Everything is completely insulated. Anybody with any power whatsoever was an Antar. But once again, as we've been talking about, they still kept grifting. Plenty of people, plenty of very smart people wanted to believe that Crazy Eddie could do what they were doing. But you always had those skeptics who sat there and said, it's always a problem when it's all family at this level. You're making this time of money and everybody who's making the decision is the family. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just thinking this now. It was the cousin who they made CFO, and he basically just started working there, and they're like, all right, we're going to send you to school so that you can come on back and be the CFO. You're not going to get real training. You're not going to go somewhere else and do this. It's like they would just farm out their own family just so they can bring him back and put him in a, quote unquote position of leadership to kind of keep that moving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The top people in the company were members of the family, and it was basically a family business. Even after they went public, it was a family business, which raised eyebrows, but it was legal. So they got away with it, that one of the major aspects of the fraud was that they brought into the business their cousin as chief financial officer. He was just a kid in his 20s, a very bright guy, but his main qualification was that he had figured out how to steal. He had figured out how to commit fraud. So they sent him to college. Eddie sent his cousin to Baruch College on 23rd Street, Manhattan, and he got a great education, as an accountant. Then they brought him into the company, and he was always working for the company. They had him working for the auditing company to get his training. In order to get your certification as an accountant, you have to work for an accounting firm for a while to become a CPA. So they had him working for the company that was auditing Crazy Eddie's books, this little accounting company, little auditing company in Brooklyn. So they had him working little accounting company in Brooklyn. That was the most ridiculous conflict of interest. So he saw from the outside what was going on, how auditors work, and then he got the job of chief financial officer. The whole family was involved, Crazy Eddie, either in the top echelons, Eddie's brothers, Eddie's father, Eddie's first wife was on the payroll. Eddie's mother-in-law was on the payroll. To a certain extent, it's kind of benign. It's a family business. You give employment to members of your family. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, family comes first, right? Shouldn't it? But if you're a criminal, as Eddie was, it also means that you bring family members into the crime, and you can trust them, presumably, not to rat you out. Because after all, blood is thicker than water, right? Well, it didn't quite turn out that way, but this was the mentality that Eddie had. I've got my brother here. I've got my cousin is my consigliere, so to speak, my financial advisor, my financial mastermind. My father is working with me. That was another major mistake that Eddie made, which is that he wasn't going to be betrayed by his family. And the reason that was a mistake was because he was screwing them constantly. So how can you expect people, if you're going to bring your family into the business to be your co-conspirators, how can you expect them to just simply take it if you're ripping them off, breaking promises to them, lying to them? That was Eddie's big mistake.
Is he a sociopath? At the end of this, it feels like everyone will be sacrificed along the way if Crazy Eddie has to. Like, when you finish all your interviews, when you finish all of your research, do you sit there and say this guy just has no morals, no feelings whatsoever? He's just looking out for himself? Or did you come across anything that said this is a guy who got in too deep and just, rats from a sinking ship?
Well, I didn't specifically say in the book whether he was a sociopath, but that's an excellent question. Was he a sociopath? I'm not a psychologist, but he seems to fit all the qualifications, doesn't he? He seemed to have no conscience. I mean, he screwed over everybody. He screwed over his first wife, for crying out loud. Eventually, when things got too hot, and he screwed over everybody. As I was saying, he screwed every single individual. He screwed over the marketing guy who came up with all these wonderful commercials. Why? Why screw this guy who is doing such a terrific job making your commercials, which are bringing in all the customers? Why screw them? Eddie had a compunction. He was a compulsive liar. And I don't know what you call that. I'm not a doctor, but yeah, he was undoubtedly a sociopath. Maybe worse. I would say maybe worse.
Might have to make up a new name for him.
Yeah, I guess you could call him pathological liar. I guess that would be fair. I mean, the man is deceased, so who knows? But you look at the interviews that he eventually gave. Skipping on ahead, you see, when he did in fact eventually talk to people, he gave interviews to some newspapers late in life, filled with lies, one lie after another.
If they never went for the IPO, does Eddie get away with this in perpetuity? I mean, are we still talking about Crazy Eddie stories today if they don't go for the IPO? I mean, it seems like there is just a couple of changes and Eddie gets away with this forever. Is that possible?
Oh, yeah. I think it's entirely possible. I mean, if there is some question as to whether, because he was so treacherous, whether eventually everything would have unwound. So I don't think it's necessarily the case. We can only speculate, but I think there is certainly a good chance. I'd say maybe at least a 50% chance that had he not gone public, I think there's a reasonable chance that he'd have been able to continue. He would not have gone to prison. Some aspect of fraud would have just continued pretty much indefinitely until he retired. I think that's entirely possible.
What was the most interesting thing you found digging into all of this? You did some interviews with people very, very close to this and things like that. What was the most amazing thing that you came about, the most surprising thing you found out?
Well, first of all, I was surprised because I was not expecting it. There were organized crime aspects that I've alluded to. I was not expecting in terms of, one of his employees became street boss of the Banana crime family. This is not, a major part of the Crazy Eddie story, but it's just, there were so many subplots, 2 organized crime subplots. One of his early suppliers was a numbers banker in the Bronx. He sort of like comes in out of left field, some of this stuff. The fact that Eddie's father had a family, before Eddie, sort of the big family secret. The thing that struck me about the Crazy Eddie story was all the subplots. The fact that you lift up a rock, then you see another rock under that. Yeah, I would say the weirdness of much of this story was not quite what I expected. It goes beyond a simple fraud or because it's a family story and it's sort of the ultimate dysfunctional family. There's a lot of strangeness involved in this, which I was not expecting.
I would like to talk about the strangest part of this. I have not been this surprised by a book in a long time, and I read a lot of books. Tell me about Crazy Eddie Med School.
Oh, yeah.
That was the most insane thing. If I didn't know that you were writing nonfiction, Gary, I would have read that section and went, well, this thing has jumped the shark. This is too insane. This person made it up. Please tell me about Crazy Eddie Med School.
Well, that's another thing that was under a rock. Eddie, he and some buddies got together and started up a medical school in California. His stores offered insane prices, right? They weren't really insane prices, but that's what he said they were. Well, look, here's a customer base, kids who want to become doctors but can't get into medical school. And they don't want to go to some medical school in Mexico where they have to learn Spanish. So let's set up a medical school in the Caribbean. And let's make it so that pretty much whatever your grades, come on in. We'll give you a medical degree and whatever. And that's what he did. He and his partners set up a medical school in the Caribbean. And it started to fall apart from the very beginning. I mean, the reason it fell apart is the same reason that ultimately Crazy Eddie fell apart, is that they were lying to people. They were lying to the students. They promised them a library of this, of that, of that. They arrived and they just saw a bunch of shacks. I mean, there was nothing there. So people started to demand their money back, and it all just fell apart. And one of the Crazy Eddie people involved actually was jailed out there in the Caribbean. Apparently, they throw you in jail in the Caribbean if you rip people off. And yeah, imagine that.
Imagine that, right?
Now, again, this would have all there would have been no publicity about any of this had it not been for the fact that Eddie was going public. So since he had extended loans to the medical school, it had to be disclosed in the IPO prospectus. Otherwise, he would have gotten away with it. It was such an oddity that, here is this guy who's in the electronics business, who's running a shady operation, but okay, it's an electronic business and he's starts to go to the Caribbean, set up a medical school. And what the hell is all that about? But you think about it, it's basically the same thing. You got customers who want low prices. There's customers who want low admission standards.
It's amazing. It's a perfect microcosm of his arrogance. Just that little anecdote of selling stereos, decided, why not a med school? Why not me creating a med school? And if I'm going to do it, let's go to the Caribbean. That's where we're going to have some fun.
Why not? So he had a friend who was actually a doctor, a psychologist, admittedly, not a medical doctor. But so he set up this medical school. And, they recruited, they put ads in college papers. Hey, you want to become a doctor? Come on over here. Join our medical school. It's all the same thing,
One of the last questions I always ask just to wrap it up, which I think we've given 100 answers to this already, but started up History Nerds United because people say, I don't like history, I don't like nonfiction, it's always boring, right? What would you say to one of those people when they say, I don't read nonfiction, why should I read Retail Gangster? What would be your answer to that one?
Well, because this is the kind of story that you couldn't make up because it was just too strange. If you're interested in a great story, in a great yarn, then I would say that Retail Gangster is for you, because I couldn't write a novel like this. I couldn't make up all this stuff. It's too strange. It's too peculiar. If you were to write a novel where from the beginning to the end, there is something strange and peculiar and something that doesn't make any sense, I couldn't write a novel like that.
I absolutely agree. Gary, thank you so much for coming on. And everybody should go buy the book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that's it for this episode. Gary, thank you so much for coming on. Retail Gangster, available August 23rd everywhere. Great book, everybody. Go read it. In the meantime, hey, listen to the other podcasts. Reach out to us on social media, Insta, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you can find us. Please leave reviews for the podcast. Get to us any way you can. Let us know what you like, nerds. Let us know what you need more of. We'll get it for you. We promise. Within reason. Don't be weird. Till next time, nerds.